Graffiti artists are fearless. One of the few art forms that I have found that the artist is willing to risk personal injury and harm for their art form. There's an athleticism to graffiti that a lot of art forms don't have. These guys are trying to get up all over the city. The higher, the better. They're scaling the high rises. The graffiti towers in downtown LA is a perfect example of what graffiti artists will do to make a statement. And so, yeah, so I've always admired them for their courage of conviction, their sense of adventure, and the sense of risk that they're willing to take to get their voice out and be heard and seen. And I think there's something to be, learn from, that our world could learn from in terms of graffiti.
Hello, and welcome back to the MO Podcast. I am your host, Joey Flores, here as always with my co-host, Jonathan Neal. And today we are thrilled to welcome Scott Sourdough Power to the show. Scott is a creative visionary, entrepreneur, and advocate for the arts, and he's the co-founder and creative director of Crewest Studio, where he has dedicated himself to telling powerful stories through art, podcasts, events, and documentaries. He's also the founder of Not Real Art, a groundbreaking platform that celebrates creative freedom and empowers artists through grants, storytelling, and community building. With over 3 decades of experience in design, publishing, and media, Scott has collaborated with some of the world's most recognizable brands, from Disney to Instagram, all while championing the voices of emerging artists. Whether through his ventures like Arterial Inc. or his unique approach to merging art and commerce, Scott has left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joey. That's awesome. Jonathan, great to see you again, my friend.
You too.
Yeah, so Scott, according to the internet, and actually your Zoom moniker here, your name is Scott Sourdough Power. Other than the fact that sour rhymes with power, is there a story behind this nickname?
Oh, yes, there's a story. There's the long version and the short version. How much time do we have? The short version is that I wrote a sourdough cookbook that was published back in 1992. It went into 3 editions. It's out of print now. But right before the pandemic, right, it went out of print just when everybody was so into sourdough. It was so trendy. But the more interesting story is perhaps why I wrote a sourdough cookbook. And that is a longer story, but I'll I guess sum it up by saying that, back in college, I decided to do, I guess, what many young people decide to do, which was, rebel against the system, rebel against the man. And I decided to drop out of college, quit my job, and move to the Arctic and live like Grizzly Adams off the grid for a year. And built a log cabin and hunted for my meat and had to, of course, make my own bread. And sourdough was a wonderful way of maintaining, my nutrition and making bread and sourdough pancakes and things. And so that's ultimately what led to my sourdough cookbook. But the naming is sort of interesting because if you know a little bit of history about the Klondike Gold Rush of the 19th century, sort of fortune-seeking prospectors who headed to Alaska seeking their fortunes, those prospectors who actually survived and lived, and found their stride there for 2 or 3 or more seasons, also used sourdough and became known as sourdoughs. And so anyway, I thought many years ago, when it was time for me to find a creative pseudonym, I thought sourdough seemed to fit. So that's the story.
That's amazing. I guess, it's funny. I've been developing a Gold Rush board game for a couple of years now. And I had no idea there was a gold rush in Alaska, and I don't know why anyone who could go to San Francisco would go to Alaska back then. I mean, that just sounds like terribly brutal.
Oh, and it was. I mean, it absolutely was brutal, and so many of those folks, they just had nothing left to lose. They had nothing to lose, so why not risk it all? And that, so it's an incredible time in history, and it was very difficult. We romanticize it now, but for those of us who have actually, felt what 60 below zero feels like, that is quite difficult.
All the
Yeah.
Bitcoin miners are heading to Alaska too right now anyway, so it's just history
Right.
repeating itself. Maybe the first time is tragedy, second time is farce, but it's still, there's still gold in them Nar hills.
Well, good, though, you crypto miners, get your sourdough cookbook. It'll come in handy.
When you're trying to maintain the server stacks in 60 below weather outside, you got something to do, and you're cooped up little hovels. Make some sourdough.
Indeed.
I'm happy to say that the only 60 below zero I've ever experienced is in my checking account. But moving on. All right, so Scott, you have built Crewest Studio as well as Not Real Art, among other projects. So the MO podcast, the MO stands for many different things, but one of them is magnum opus, and I'm curious, like, for you, which of the things that you've built is your biggest and proudest achievement so far?
Man, it's such a great question. If I'm going to answer that, I have to be honest, right? And I think the honest answer is, and I mean this sincerely, I think at a very young age, I sort of looked at my life as my masterpiece. We live and die by the choices we make. And, I saw my dad go to a job that he hated out of, duty, to the family. I'm a working class kid from a blue collar town in the Midwest outside Chicago, Steel Town, Gary, Indiana. And so at a very young age, I think I saw a lot of people working very hard in miserable conditions. And I said, I don't want that, and interestingly, I didn't want to, I knew I didn't want to climb a corporate ladder either. On some level. I think, I think I've always been a creative, the heart of an artist, romantic, idealist. And there's something about that in my life that, early on, I said, I just want to do cool stuff. I just want to have adventures. I just want to, have an interesting life, not a long life necessarily. If it's a long life, great. But if I want to have an interesting life, and I think, the choices I sort of, when I was in high school, I discovered there was a gentleman professor named Joseph Campbell, and he had done a series of interviews with Bill Moyers, who's sort of famous on PBS back in those days, and he had done a series of kind of interviews with Bill, and that became a series called The Power of Myth. And it was, in Joseph Campbell, who was an expert in belief systems and mythologies, talked about the role of myth and belief systems in our daily lives and in cultures and societies throughout history. And he talked a lot about the hero's journey, which is sort of, I don't know, a prodigal son like kind of story on some level. And I guess I was the black sheep of my family. Let me be clear. And I sort of saw myself in that. I thought, you know what, man, I want to be on a hero's journey. I want to do something, really interesting. And I think that was just the ethos that I sort of made decisions on. And if it seemed interesting to me, even at the young age of 17, 18, 19, I did it, or I tried to do it anyway. And so, now if you would have told me I would be today here on a podcast with you guys, I would never have guessed it. My life has become in so many ways exactly what I didn't expect, but I also but in many ways it exceeded my expectations to the extent that I had any expectations. And I just feel like, we live and die by the choices we make. And I've been lucky enough, I think, to make choices that have made my life, hopefully my masterpiece, if that makes sense. So in terms of my MO, I think that's it. I'm just trying to surround myself, with creative people doing creative things, and making a creative difference in the world. I'm 54 now. When I turned 40, and I don't really care about age. It's not like it's ever been a big deal, but I do tend to get introspective on my birthdays. And I remember when I turned 40, I went to the beach for a long walk, and I asked myself a simple question. 40 years is kind of an interesting time to look back, right? And I asked myself a simple question. I said, when have I been most happy? In 40 years, when have I been most happy? And the answer came very quickly. I've been most happy in my life when I've been creative, working with creative people, doing creative things, and when I've been outdoors, like those two things. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try to do more of that to the extent that I have another 40 years left. Let me do more of that. And so, here we are.
So your magnum opus is building the life that you want for yourself, which I think.
Well,
like,
I think,
a lot of
yeah. I
people
mean,
don't really-
I guess what I'm arguing is I would challenge everybody to think of their life as their magnus opus. Like think of your life as your masterpiece, and the choices you make define, your reality and define people's perception of you and define your reputation. So, choose carefully.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think a lot of people think like, what job do I want or what relationship do I want? But like, they don't go so meta as to take a step back and say like, how do I create like the whole life that I want?
Yeah, well, and look, I'm sensitive to the fact that, while I was the first college educated kid in my family and I'm a blue collar working class kid from the Midwest, I'm also very aware that I was a straight white male born in 1970. So I had a certain amount of privilege that others don't have. So it's easy for me to say, oh yeah, follow your bliss, do go on adventures when majority of the world is just looking for food and water. Oh,
sure, absolutely. Well, at some point you decided to become very entrepreneurial. Maybe that there was flashes of that earlier in your career, but tell us, what was your inspiration? I think, Crewest came before Not Real Art, correct? And so what was your inspiration and what was your journey like from pre-entrepreneurial days to founding Crewest?
Sure. No, I mean, look, I feel like to the extent.
Let me not interrupt you, Scott, but why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about what Crewest is and does?
Yes. So a Crewest studio was born out of an art gallery called Crewest Gallery. My business partner founded Crewest Gallery in 2002, and I was an advisor and a financier and a curator advisor. And for 10 years, we curated over 100 shows featuring 2,000 artists from 20 countries. We were the first, one of the first, if not the first, art galleries in LA to really give graffiti artists a legitimate venue to showcase their art. And of course, this predates street art and that phrase. And after 10 years of doing some really wonderful shows, surviving the '08 crash, my partner, who really ran the gallery, founded the gallery and ran the gallery day to day as an artist, and he, after 10 years, decided he wanted to mission accomplished and let me go be an artist now, and double down on his practice. And so we closed the gallery in 2012, with the last show being, mission accomplished, featuring so many of the artists. And many of the artists that we featured, of course, have gone on to great success and fame. I'm very proud to say, but not necessarily because of us, but we were a stop on the journey. And so, it was a sad, bittersweet day, right, when we closed the gallery. And but we knew we wanted to keep the ethos alive, and we decided to start Crewest Studio. And Crewest Studio, generally speaking, early on was really positioned more as a creative agency for brands. And because that's sort of my background. I got my start as a graphic designer in 1988 in Chicago, working kind of in the advertising world, the marketing services world, working for big brands like Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola. And so to start a little creative agency in 2012 called Crewest Studio made a lot of sense. And we did very well for a couple of years, doing some very cool projects with some very cool brands. But I guess it was around 2018. We had there was a bunch of things that happened. Clients are fickle. The business has changed so much. The marketing services game, in 30 years, been crazy to see. And so we just decided that, we were tired of being in the client business. Like, we love our clients, but we hate our clients. and, but we love artists and we love helping artists. And, having worked with artists all these years and having had the agency and being a creative person ourselves, we thought that, what we should be doing is helping artists tell their stories and promote their work. What we felt like we should be doing was telling stories and creating content that helped to democratize art and serve an audience like us. It feels underserved. I mean, I feel like the creative class is not really serviced by the media landscape, in a real way. I mean, sure, you can find interesting arts related content, on PBS or Netflix maybe, or YouTube, but it's there isn't a brand out there that I've found, like I like to say, if you're a sports fan, you have ESPN. If you're a news junkie, you have CNN. If you're a evangelical Christian, you have Trinity Broadcasting Network. But if you're a creative or you're an artist, where do you go for your content? And it's spread out everywhere. And so anyway, the idea is that, well, Crewest Studio could be part of the solution. We could develop content that would serve the creative class, that would help artists get exposure and help them tell their stories and promote their work. So we became very passionate about really a focus on media and entertainment for the creative class. And that was about 2018. And how do you start a media company with no money? Well, you start a podcast. and that's what we did. And that's how Not Real Art was born. We thought, well, let's start a podcast. And what do we want it to be? What do we want, what do we want to call it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the brand, Not Real Art brand, if you will, was launched as a podcast initially back in 2019, I guess, 2018, 2019. And but as an artist creative, I think since high school, right? I mean, and I come from a musical family. I mean, we weren't really didn't have a lot of money and whatever, but my mom was an incredible singer and piano player, and she was the choir director at the church. And so, music was always kind of around the house, so to speak. And, so I was that kid that, had to take piano lessons, and much to my chagrin, but found joy in playing the saxophone. And so anyway, coming from a kind of a musical creative background, I feel like that, that's the other side of the coin for entrepreneurship. I feel like entrepreneurs are kind of deep down on some level a creative and an artist, because they're seeing something, that the rest of us don't see. Right. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a little bit about my journey.
Scott, why do you think that it's difficult to create a media concern or enterprise or channel equivalent to a kind of ESPN for culture, the creative class?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, because, we're living in an age of disruption, right? When it comes to media and entertainment, the whole landscape has changed. It's become atomized in many ways. Back when we were coming up, or when I was coming up, there were three major networks, and 30 million people sat down at 7 o'clock to watch, Charlie's Angels or Dallas or whatever it was at the time. And then and then cable television came along, and competition went up. Then the digital revolution, brought in, YouTube, for example, and YouTube's actually the biggest streamer in the world, not Netflix. But then, Netflix comes along, right? And you have Hollywood, which is sort of a legacy system, Fat and Happy. And this little disruptor, Silicon Valley disruptor, comes along called Netflix, and, really, upsets the apple cart. So I think, there's a lot of flux going on, starting these, endeavors have always been difficult. They required a lot of money. I mean, I use ESPN as an example because I think it gets the point across, but let's be frank, right? I mean, it took years and years and billions of dollars to make ESPN. But it also, came out of a need. I mean, the cable network, cable television came along. They had all these extra channels they needed to fill with content, and ESPN started broadcasting local high school football games. So that's part of it. The other part of it, I think, is the fact that there's a conventional wisdom in Hollywood that the creative class is some niche group that doesn't deserve, to be served because maybe there's not a lot of money there, et cetera, et cetera. I once had a Hollywood executive tell me, because I was talking about, I was saying, well, look, I mean, you guys are always looking for sources of fresh content, fresh story ideas. The art world that I know, for example, is filled with untold human stories that you might want to develop into, that you could mine for interesting stories. And this Hollywood executive said to me, Scott, nobody wants to watch a TV show about paint drying. And I thought, fuck you.
Yeah.
You're an idiot, like the arrogance, right? And this is exactly why Hollywood is imploding right now, because of that kind of arrogance,
Yeah, that's reductionary. It's insulting.
I was gonna say, like, yeah, and it's like, and if you don't, like, we can sell bananas for $6 million. Like, dude, you should be. It seems like you would be really would want to be in this business.
It was just I couldn't believe it, and but I guess I shouldn't be shocked, but I mean, we know this, right? Because I'm preaching to the choir right now. I mean, we're all in this world together, but what a lot of people don't realize that, in the US alone, arts industries contribute $760 billion to the economy and supports 4.9 million jobs, that 134 million American adults identify as arts enthusiasts or arts participants, and 2.5 million Americans identify as artists. So, if that's a subculture or a niche, give it to me, because to me that seems pretty exciting and robust.
Yeah, it's also drastically underreported, because how many people should call themselves artists but feel like they can't, or wouldn't self-identify as an artist, even though I don't know that my uncle would call himself an artist, but man, he's like the most mind-blowing woodworker. Like, he makes these just incredible urns and different things for people in the small town that he lives in. I mean, they are some of the most beautiful objects I've ever seen, and I don't know that he would call himself an artist, so I think that number's got to be lower. I mean, higher than what is reported.
I would agree, and that's such an interesting point, because we've done, and I say we, I mean, the art, so-called art world, first world of art, has done such a great job, right, of convincing us that being an artist or art is a very certain specific thing. Real art, real artist, very specific thing. And if you don't fit that, well, then you're not a artist, and that's not real art, not real art.
Hashtag not real art.
Right. And people ask me all the time, they say, well, Scott, are you an artist? I said, well, never trust a wise man who calls himself wise. It's really not for me to say, I don't think whether I'm an artist or not, you tell me, but I would say, sure, artist with a lowercase a, sure, I'll take that. I'm not trying to make a living, I'm not a professional artist per se, so that would be capital A, but I think, yes, it's all in us. There's a story that I tell all the time. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the book, Orbiting the Giant Hairball. Do you know that book?
No,
Orbiting the
never
Giant Hairball. Okay, so Orbiting the Giant Hairball was written by Gordon McKenzie. And Gordon McKenzie was the chief creative officer for Hallmark Cards. Okay. And he would go as a way of giving back. He wrote this book, Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It's really about how do you maintain your artistic integrity when you work for the man, right? When you work for some corporate environment. And so, but he would go.
It's the best title ever. Sorry.
Right. Oh, totally. Right. And so he would go give lectures at schools and talk to school kids as a way of giving back. And he always started his talks with the same question. And that question was, who here is an artist? And in kindergarten, every kid raised their hand, right? And then he said in first grade, like half the class would raise their hand. And by third grade, there was like one kid in the back that sheepishly raised their hands. Yeah, I'm an artist, right? And it's sort of like, what are we doing? You know, what kind of system have we created that kills the spirit of a child who wants to be an artist, believes they're an artist, and we all know that creativity is the only thing that's going to solve the greatest problems we have. And it's fascinating, especially when you consider that Sharpie markers, maybe you guys saw this, but Sharpie markers recently did a study and found that 75% of Americans want to be remembered for their creativity above all else. And when you talk about, exactly, right? And when you talk about your uncle, I think you said, Joey, your uncle that's an incredible woodworker, of course he's an artist. Of course he's, feeding that need we all have to express ourselves creatively and scratch that itch that we have, because there's something, I think, primal and fundamental about making things with their hands and feeling creative.
100%. Yeah, but I think even myself, I mean, I've been making art my whole life, and it was 2 years ago in Guadalajara. I was talking to this sculptor, and we were talking, and I said something about whatever, he said, "Are you an artist?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "When did you finally allow yourself to start saying yes to that question?" And I found it really interesting because it made me think. I was like, it was recent, and that's really crazy.
When did you become so self-absorbed to be able to call yourself an artist?
Totally.
When did you embrace your narcissism and just finally go for it? It's definitely something that comes with middle age, right? Like you don't give an F any longer.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. It's a really, yeah. And
well, I think it's interesting that the statistic that you just gave, this idea that people want to be sort of like recognized for their creativity, right? That I think brings up an important point, something that I've thought about a lot, which is that so much of what the various different art worlds that we inhabit are geared towards is recognition as much, if not more, than simply market success, right? And I think this is what people talk about when they talk about things like, oh, something was a critical and a commercial success, right? Well, critical is just a shorthand for recognition from a audience, a peer group, people who the filmmakers or the producers or the artists respect and admire themselves, and they get that approbation reflected back to them. It can happen probably, to a certain extent from a pop star being able to, that first experience of sitting on a stage and having tens of thousands of people singing your lyrics back to you and being like, wow, like this thing actually has sort of achieved a level of penetration. But it's another thing when another artist who you admire, maybe someone who is slightly more senior in the industry than you are, reaching out and saying, hey, I really like this work that you've done, and I appreciate or admire what you do, or let's work together, let's collaborate, let's do something together. I think those moments of recognition, or those channels of recognition are in some ways the things that really drive what artists in a broad definition are after. And I think that it, like you're talking about, Joy, like your uncle in the woodworking, it's like, well, you gotta do something to put it out there in order to gain at least a modicum of recognition, right? You've got to show it to people, you've got to share it with people. And there's often a difficulty. One, there can be economic difficulty in simply being able to do that, to figure out what it's going to look like. I think there are many people out there who also don't have that, this is to put it in a sort of negative term, but like a little bit of that sort of self-affirmation that means like, oh, I'm doing something enough that's worthy enough of other people's attention, that I respect myself enough that the work that I'm doing, I can put out there for others to actually engage with. So there's always a kind of gap that someone's got to get over in that first instance. But once you do it, to have enough of an audience, even like 100 people come out that's not just friends and family, even if it is just friends and family, right? If you've got like 100 strangers who walk into a gallery or go to see a concert and hear the opening act and are like, oh, wow, like that was really good. I really like this thing. Like it enough to be able to talk to other people about it, show it and share it to other people and spend a little bit amount of their time and attention. That kind of recognition is really the kinds of things I think that sustains a lot of folks. And then you have to be a real sicko megalomaniac to like want to make that your entire life.
It's so true. I mean, like artists are people too, right? Artists are human too. And speaking of that, like, it's like, I got plenty of hugs from my mom, but I didn't get enough hugs from my dad. So, on certain level, right? Like we all want to be loved. We all want that to be seen and heard, right? By our parents. And if we didn't get that, we want to get seen and heard by, our colleagues or our friends. And
Right.
when you're an artist, you're that much more.
That's right.
Maybe,
You gotta fill
right.
you gotta fill that gaping hole in your heart with the love and approbation of your adoring fans who want to stalk you back home to the to the Chateau Marmont 4 o'clock in the morning to get a selfie.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh my God. So funny. Well, Jonathan, it's interesting because I mean, you touch on something I've thought a lot about too, and talked to artists about this as well because I think this is changing a lot now for all kinds of reasons over the last 20 years. But historically, I feel like the so-called art world, first world of art, has given us basically one business model, right, to pursue. So like, oh, if you're going to be a legitimate artist, there's only one legitimate path, and oh, by the way, go to Yale and get your MFA, whatever, right? And that has really been, I think, and that is legitimate. I mean, that's one business model that clearly works for a certain number of people. But for the rest of the world who's trying to be creative or find their voices, and express themselves creatively, it's like that business model may not work. And, I've said to artists before, it's sort of like, you really need to ask yourself, why do I want to be an artist? Why do I want to make art? And it feels to me there's sort of three dimensions. I mean, or three pathways. It's like, if you want to make art to make history, great. That path is pretty well worn. You kind of know that path. If you want to make art for fortune, make art to make a fortune, well, that's maybe a slightly different path with different choices, right? And if you want to make art to have fun and give, and find joy, well, then that's another kind of set of choices and another pathway. And I think, we need to be very clear with ourselves and honest with ourselves. Why are we making art and what do we want? And if it is to make history, well, okay, there's maybe that requires a certain a series of choices, right? And if you want to make a ton of money, okay, well, that might be a lot. And by the way, those two things might be mutually exclusive, right? And if you're making art to make joy, well, maybe you'll make a fortune and maybe you'll make history, but that's not necessarily what your intent is going at, right?
Certainly, if you weigh too heavily the historical impact and the money making, you're less likely, in my opinion, to have a lot of fun. I don't know that many professional artists who are like stoked about the work that they do every day. They're fantastic. I mean, like I know an incredible composer. He works on like great movies and all kinds of stuff, but it's a job and he's long since stopped making music for himself. And, it's just, it's interesting what happens when people become professionals. Jonathan, you were talking about, this difference between like sort of, thousands or of people singing your lyrics back to you and the kind of recognition that is versus like, somebody you respect telling you what have you. Elton John covered a Metallica song. And I saw this clip of Metallica on Howard Stern, and he brought in over video conferencing, he brought Elton John into the conversation and said why, Elton, why did you cover this Metallica song? And so keep in mind, Metallica sold 125 million records, right? I mean, you don't need outside validation, right? Like 125 million records, probably many Grammys. And anyways, Elton John says, oh, I think it's one of the best songs ever written. And the lead singer of Metallica just starts like crying. Basically, he's just like he was like completely speechless. Like, and Lars looking over at him and like and you could just see James just like, what? Like, oh, John just said I wrote one of the best songs ever written. Like, the impact it had was so obvious. It was incredible. Really, there's a video of it on the web.
We'll link to it in the show
That's
notes.
cool.
Really
That's cool.
inspiring.
I still have not seen Elton John in concert, and now that he's, I think, technically blind, sadly, I don't know if you heard that the other day, but I guess he's really losing his eyesight. So I don't know what that will mean for his tour, but I have seen Metallica, but I have not seen Elton John, unfortunately.
I've seen Metallica 4 times now. The last time was last October, and they're still insane. I mean, they're so good. James Hetfield's voice is a little bit shot, just as were almost everybody that I saw at that festival. But they're still
happens with age. Scott, I wanted to ask you, given the a decade's worth of time given to the graffiti community, what do you think that the sort of the art world today could continue to learn from the graffiti, now kind of street art community, that it hasn't yet adopted or understood?
Wow, that's a great question. What's interesting about the so-called art world these days vis-a-vis graffiti is that, and we knew this would happen, at least we believed it, but we expected it to happen, because, the art world is nothing, is nothing if it's not opportunistic, right? We're always looking for the next big thing. And so many times, trends or opportunities come from the underground, come from the subculture. And, and graffiti gave birth to street art. I mean, muralism was always a thing and public art is not always a thing. But, this idea, it's interesting to see how graffiti came, in street art came, and there's a big conversation we could have around that as well. But I think, to try to answer your question more specifically, there's a fearlessness that graffiti artists have that I think the art world just doesn't. I think we could all agree that there's a very real sense of risk aversion and conservatism in the art world in many ways. I was reading about, I guess there was a piece of art at the Miami Art Fair featuring Donald Trump, and they asked the gallery to remove the artwork. And it's that kind of cowardness and lack of courage that graffiti artists don't have. Graffiti artists are fearless. And by the way, one of the few art forms that I have found that the artist is willing to risk personal injury and harm for their art form. There's an athleticism to graffiti that a lot of art forms don't have. These guys are trying to get up all over the city. The higher, the better. They're scaling the high rises, the graffiti towers in downtown LA is a perfect example of what graffiti artists will do to make a statement. And so I've always admired them for their courage of conviction, their sense of adventure, the sense of risk that they're willing to take to get their voice out and be heard and seen. And I think there's something to be, learn from, that our world could learn from in terms of graffiti. And and the art world is definitely trying to tap into that now, or at least tap into the commercial opportunities of some of these artists. I mean, Jeffrey Deitch, famously did the Art in the Street show at MoCA. What was that, 2008 or something? And it was the most commercially successful show in the history of MoCA. There was a lot of critique around the lack of scholarship and so on and so forth. But, it's a very populist art form for sure. But and that's the beauty of it. If it's a doorway into other kinds of art and museums and other expressions, great. And just because something's popular doesn't mean it's bad art. I mean, I would say that graffiti specifically is a language born of a very specific socioeconomic segment of society, and there is there is a culture around that. There's not best practices. There's rules. I mean, there's and so. Yeah, it's a very interesting culture, and I think that our world is trying to tap into that in many ways now. But I suspect that there will be many times where graffiti artists want to push the envelope, and that in the art world or the gallery may be uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that graffiti and hip hop emerge out of the same locales at the same time, right? And they're two of arguably, distinctive indigenous American art forms. I think, blues and jazz, obviously from 40 or 50 years prior, but in the second half of the 20th century, graffiti and hip hop are distinctly American products that then get exported around the world. In the ensuing 50 years now, hip hop is the establishment, right? Hip hop is the far and away the most successful, establishment musical industry in the world, arguably, right?
Yep.
And yet graffiti remains this this kind of niche. It'd be too impolite to call it sideshow, but we know it's definitely not the mainstream, even in the art and cultural sector. And I'm curious, do you have a theory on why that's the case? Is that just legacy Anglo-European snobbishness? Is it just that music is more populist in its ideas and has a way of being distributed directly to the consumer in a way that art requires so many levels of mediation, curation, institutional certifications, however you want to think about it? What's your theory of the case in terms of why graffiti, street art runs so far behind hip hop in terms of its adoption?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's a lot of layers to it. I mean, music is I mean, as you've already indicated, I mean, graffiti is one of the four pillars of hip hop, right? So there's the turntablism, right? The music, there's the emceeing, there's the b-boy dance, and then there's graffiti. And dancing, b-boy stuff, break dancing, emceeing, rap, and turntablism, music. That's very accessible for a lot of people. So I guess on a certain level, I'm not surprised that the music aspect of hip hop has blown up before and a bigger than graffiti, for example. It is interesting too, because I remember, growing up when hip hop came out, so to speak, and my introduction to hip hop, I was a jazz and blues kid. I mean, I was, ditching school, sneaking into jazz and blues clubs in Chicago when I was 16. And I was a little bit of a snob when it came to music in that way. And when hip hop came along, being a white guy, in Northwest Indiana, I remember thinking, oh, this is just a phase. Like, this is a trend, like so many other kind of art forms or music genres, this will come and go. I didn't realize that it was actually not going anywhere, because it's a culture, it's a world, it was a people that had not been seen and heard, and they were, now was a moment, right, for them to finally be seen and heard. And boy, like jazz music was embraced by the world in a way that jazz music wasn't embraced by Americans. I mean, it's funny, I have a couple of buddies who are professional jazz pianists, and they would go to Europe and they were rock stars in Europe. Right. And then they would come back to Chicago, and they were like, just broke artists. Right. Yeah. And so I think, that's part of it. The other thing I would say to your point, in terms of it being graffiti art being accepted, I mean, not to sound cynical about it, but I mean, a lot of people are just they're lemmings, right? They have to be told, they have to be given permission. And I think, and art collectors are a lot like that too. It takes a dealer or a curator or someone to say, oh, okay, no, this is acceptable, or this is the artist of the day, and you should collect this. And then, collectors like to go, okay, my advisor told me that I should buy
Sure.
this, so I'm going to buy this.
But
So
you
that's
had
part of
that,
it.
like you said, Jeffrey Deitch has been out there since the 1980s, has been showing this work and has been promoting many of these artists and giving them a stage, and gave them one of the biggest stages in the country when he made it to the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA and put on the Art in the Streets show, right? Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's one of those things where it's not in. I mean, he seems to be a singular light amongst a kind of river of darkness here, but there is a sense that there have been these attempts with very well placed,
Yeah.
influential individuals providing this platform, and remarkably, the kind of, I don't know, reactionary pushback. I mean, again, I don't, it might be one of those things though. There's only so far that the genre or the medium or the activities can go, and maybe there's a larger argument to be made
Yeah.
for how much of contemporary art is actually inflected by, influenced by, as
Yeah.
draws from a longer tradition of kind of street and graffiti activity. But I would question that assumption. I think that there genuinely is like a feeling like this kind of work only goes so far in one
Yeah.
direction and only has so much to offer the sort of larger sphere of what contemporary
Yeah.
art can be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're exactly right. And I would frame it, or maybe say it slightly differently, because what I was ramping up to is this idea that, I think that there is a rawness to graffiti, and there's an aggressiveness, there's a power, there's a rough around the edges, diamond in the rough, whatever kind of aspect to graffiti that just doesn't appeal to a lot of people. There's a power, there's an impact, there's a rawness that is probably alienating to a lot of people, and it's singular. And I think part of it is like, so much of art, right? I mean, it is subjective, and if it doesn't speak to you, it doesn't speak to you. And I think that on a certain level, graffiti doesn't speak to a lot of people.
Throw in a couple of thoughts here. One, I think, there's a lot of graffiti artists who maybe don't take credit for their work because it would be, legally imprudent to do so, right? Like it's not always legal what they're doing. So that in and of itself could be one of the reasons why, like you don't have like sort of art stars in the graffiti world not so easily and readily as other areas.
Dude, in the 1960s, Vito Acconci built a wood platform in a gallery and sat underneath jerking off to it while, speaking into a microphone that, gave his, whispers of sweet nothings to the audience. Like, I'm sure that was breaking all sorts of laws at the time in New York. Let's just be clear.
Well, I was just thinking that, like, graffiti is not something that's distributed or purchasable, right? So like all of these other markets that have grown, it's like, people buy albums, people buy prints, people go to a museum and works travel around the country to be exhibited, which is just, not going to happen without more work.
Yeah, I mean, not to interrupt. I mean, I definitely want to point out a couple of things. This is actually a kind of a complicated topic in many ways, and I mean, part of it is also about demographics. I mean, if you're a Gen Z, millennial person, I think graffiti speaks to you and street art speaks to you in a very different way than if you're Gen X or maybe older. I remember reading a market research study by Red Bull back in the mid-aughts, and they were surveying millennials, and the question was about street art, and the response sort of overwhelmingly was that millennials felt that street art was part of their lifestyle. It wasn't something different or something that they went out to seek out. It was just part of their reality. And the flip side of street art is graffiti. So I think part of it is, demographics, but I also think, listen, let's shout out to guys like Roger Gassman who are really tapping into this culture. I mean, they've got, merch and sales and books and posters and prints and toys and buttons and t-shirts and stickers and, all kinds of stuff, are being sold with artist art and artist name on it. If you can't afford the $5,000, painting, you can go, buy the book or buy the print or what have you. And so, and I guess I tend to think of these things too as sort of like market segments. And if you're a certain age or a certain income, and your upbringing was of a certain, like, this is your youth, right? This is part of your reality. And so this is a world that you can play in and afford. And maybe if you, make more money and your career develops, okay, fine. You can trade up and you can, maybe explore other kinds of art forms and other price points of artworks. But yeah, it might be a small segment, but it is a lively segment of the contemporary art world. I mean, you look at what was happening this week in Wynwood and Miami Art Week and Art Basel. Man, I mean, it's a party over there. and part of it is because of its connection also to hip hop, right? And even guys like Set Free and what he does with athletes. NBA players are really embracing, street art and graffiti. And what's in, and yeah, so it isn't a dynamic, robust area that a lot of people maybe aren't aware of because they're too old.
I think this is a fantastic point because I just went to Europe with my family a few months ago, and in Rome, I didn't even notice that there was like a lot of graffiti, probably because I'm so used to seeing it, and it's like, to me, it's just, I mean, I might notice some graffiti if it's like really amazing, right? But otherwise, it's like, I'm not really paying attention. And when we left Rome, my dad couldn't stop complaining about how dirty he thought Rome was because of the graffiti everywhere. And it was funny because I didn't even pick up on it, but I think that's because, I mean, at this point, to me, it's all part of the landscape. But for him, it's like it wasn't like that when he was a kid, and so he sees this, this quote beautiful old city of Rome with graffiti, and he just thinks it's like doesn't belong there,
Right.
One of the things I was going to add to your comment, Jonathan, about hip hop expanding at a pace that has outperformed street art. I think one major contributing factor there is sampling. Like everything from the Beastie Boys using Led Zeppelin to Dre and Eminem using Lady Schifrin and like old soul music and things like that. You can really like bridge the divide between generations when like new songs are bringing in old sounds and samples from classics that people grew up with. So yeah, I would say like I think sampling is like a huge factor in widening the adoption of hip hop.
Well, and that's such an interesting point too, because again, going back to my own experience. I mean, I was like I said, a bit of a snob when it came to music back in those days, and when so I was a jazz, blues, classical guy playing alto saxophone at a pretty high level. And when hip hop came along and they're sampling and they're playing, and and they're spinning records and and just kind of talking into a microphone, like to me, I was like, how is that music? Like, how is this music? I don't get it. This isn't music. And the truth of the matter is, I eventually realized that, wait a minute, they can't afford an alto saxophone like I can. They can't afford having electrified instruments or what have you. And they've got what they've got. They've got the tools. And by the way, talk about ingenuity and innovation to be able to take a turntable and some records and turn it into some sonic experience that never existed before, let alone the poetry of an MC and an intelligence of an MC to be able to put words together that paint pictures and tell nuanced stories and metaphorically, that there's a genius to that, and so, even though I was like a naive, 16, 17-year-old white kid, like eventually I would learn like, no, innovation, ingenuity, art is born out of constraints and necessity. I mean, it is, and so, yeah, it's these rules is that, like, turns out we end up being very conservative. We think we're so progressive as artists or as creative people or as art professionals, but sometimes, we we're a little more conservative than we realize. At least I'm grateful that I was able to sort of see the truth.
When you
Scott,
began, sorry, Joey, when you began working with brands and doing some of the marketing work, what were the ways that the experience with Crewest Gallery and working in these environments helped, to a certain extent? I imagine brands came to you because of a certain type of sensibility and a certain type of pitch of what you were able to do. But what were the lessons that you were bringing from these creative practices and these communities that you had been working with that were, one, attractive to these brands, but two, also gave you a way of working with their stories that was ultimately helpful with how you were trying to build that business?
Right. Well, there's kind of two or three aspects of that question that I'd like to address. So, what I learned, working in, what I'll call brand strategy, brand marketing, brand design. I learned to identify consumer trends. I learned to identify white space in the marketplace. I learned to think about innovation and consumer needs and wants, and how you begin to address opportunities in the marketplace that maybe are not being served. And so when I came into the art world with that sort of that tradition, I started to look at the art world and artists in that way. How can we serve them? Where's the white space? Why is there only one business model? Why does there seem to be no innovation happening? So I brought that kind of mentality, into the art space. Now, back in the day when I was a graphic designer or a brand strategist working for agencies, what was happening was that, Procter and Gamble, of course, maybe would be, launching a new shampoo. There's 50 other shampoo brands on the shelf, right? So how is a shampoo going to differentiate and stand out and cut in and break through the noise, right? What's its unique value proposition, right? And so, that was a very interesting, exciting kind of time in my life because, I got to help develop brands and products and packaging that eventually I saw from idea to aisle, from idea to shelf. So for brands and for clients like that, it is all about relevancy. It's about ownership, being differentiated, owning an idea, a promise. It's about being memorable. It's about innovating. It's about breaking through. So there was this constant need, right, for for creativity, that would stand out. But also, let's be frank. I mean, these companies were also incredibly risk adverse. I can't tell you how many great ideas never saw the light of day. And obviously some clients are way more strategic than others. I remember, we did a bunch of work with Snapple back in the day, and our bread and butter was Procter and Gamble, and Procter and Gamble was incredibly rigorous. I mean, they could invest $30 million in a project and get some data back that showed that it wasn't worth pursuing any further, and they would kill it after spending 30 million on it, because they knew it wasn't worth it. But, a company like Snapple, they just were making it up as they went. And we would design, they would want wallpaper. I mean, however many designs, it's like, well, can we have 10 more concepts? No, we've already given you 10. You want 10 more? Like, and by the way, all these 10 meet your brief, because we're working from a creative brief, right? So the people are worried about losing their jobs. They're risk adverse. My favorite client, I'll never forget, we were doing some work with Seagram's, our London office, was doing some work with Seagram's there. And we were given a brief and a project, and we came in with our 3 concepts. And we were prepping the conference room for our presentation, and the client came in and sort of saw us prepping, and he sort of interrupts us, says, "What's this?" And he points to the 3 boards that we had covered, because there's a whole like song and dance shtick to presenting creative, right? And so we were setting up, and he said, he looks at the 3 concepts that were covered, and he's like, what are these? Well, these are, the 3 concepts. He's like, but why are there 3? Aren't you an expert? And we said, well, yes. And he said, well, if you're the expert, then why are there 3? He's like, I tell you what, I'm going to go to lunch. And when I come back, I want there to be 1 concept up there. And you're going to tell me, as an expert, why that's the best solution, that's what I have to go with. And that's what I'm going to go with. And I was like, man, oh man, let's clone this client, because they're very rare, very, very rare.
That's amazing. Scott, if you could collaborate with any brand or organization or artist in the world, like who would it be and why?
I would want to collaborate today with SiriusXM to create a talk radio channel dedicated to the arts.
Wow, that sounds awesome. Let's how do we help make it happen?
Oh yeah,
that sounds like the answer to one of our more opinions questions.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah. No, it's. I think I'm thinking a lot about obviously storytelling, media, entertainment distribution these days. But
why? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Why SiriusXM?
Well, I'm a fan. I mean, I'm a consumer of it. I mean, it's they've got presumably 35 million subs. I figure 1 to 5% of those subs would tune in to a talk radio channel dedicated to the arts and creativity. So for me, it's sort of like a North Star. I mean, I sort of say, when the day comes when I'm able to sit down with SiriusXM and have that conversation in a serious way, I will have been successful. I will achieve kind of what I'm trying to do, which is to, help democratize the art with media.
So it seems like you just have to get Rick Rubin to be your main, your main host, and there you go.
Well, you know what? You're absolutely right. And by the way, there are many Rick Rubins, right? That could host a show and host a thing. And I really believe it's going to happen eventually at some point, whether I have anything to do with it, only time will tell. And that's why I also don't mind talking about it openly, because I want it to happen. It's like maybe historically I would be all coy about, you got to sign an NDA. I'm not going to tell you my idea. I'm 54. Today's not promised. I don't know, if I'll make it to 5 o'clock today, but at least if I put these ideas out there, I believe it gives them life, and maybe it'll happen.
I've got 2 questions, random. We'll stick with this first one because it's right off of the cuffs of this comment. But either one of you feel free to answer this. But who is the Rick Rubin of the visual art world?
Well, I don't know, John, if you want to go, but I think that look, Jerry Saltz could have a show, right? He's a character, right? There are who's that young gal on TikTok these days? She's doing, oh boy, what is her name? She's doing a wonderful job. She's quirky, she's smart, she's cute. She could have a show. I mean, there are many voices that could have a show. You talk about graffiti being the pillar of hip hop. There should be a graffiti art show on LL Cool J's Ring the Bells Sirius channel, right? Burning Man should have a show on the channel. Meow Wolf should have a show on the channel, right? There are so many sources, so many storytellers that, if we had a talk radio channel, that they would be fantastic on the air, I think.
Right. I'm saying more from like the producing standpoint, like, Rick Rubin comes in and turns, these artists into, helps Metallica create, like the Black Album, right? Like complete departure from their old work, but, just totally catapults them into, the stratosphere in terms of commercial success. So I'm curious if there is a Rick Rubin in the visual art world in terms of cultivating, refining, helping artists grow.
On the evidence, obviously it's lacking.
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, part of what you're getting, I mean, to the extent that Rick Rubin is a mentor, a shepherd, a guide, a consultant, whatever, I think historically, right? I mean, wasn't that the role of the gallery, like helping shepherd artists in their careers and giving them critique and giving them advice? Jeffrey Deitch might be considered, a kind of a Rick Rubin like character in terms of helping shepherd artist careers. Certainly they're out there. I may not know them right now, but as soon as I have signed that deal with SiriusXM, I'll give them a call.
Here's my other. Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I was gonna along those same lines. I was gonna ask, what's the question, Scott, that you would want to ask artists that you think is a question that people rarely ask artists, either about their practice or about the way that they work or about art in general, that you think, just doesn't make it into the airwaves, or doesn't make it into the media, doesn't make it out there into the world, but you might think is like an actually important thing to be asking and having artists talk about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I often find myself asking artists, what story they're trying to tell, with their art. What are they trying to make people feel? What do they want people to feel when they see their art? I think, historically artists have sort of maybe been a little more, behind the scenes or whatever. The gallery did the pitch, did the talking for them. Now it's, with the democratization of technology and social media, what have you, of course, many artists now are coming out of the shadows, so to speak, and being vocal. It's fascinating to me, how many artists get stumped when I ask them that question. I'll say, what do you want people to feel? What do you want people to think? What stories are you trying to tell? And it's really interesting to me how many artists don't have an answer to that question, if they do have an answer, many of them are saying, well, it's not for me to say. I want the viewer to tell me what they think and feel. Well, okay, that's fair. But, at the end of the day, I feel like you should have a point of view. You should have you should be able to articulate, what you were thinking or feeling or what your objective was in creating that piece of art. But, like doctors, many times artists are not the best communicators.
And with equally bad signatures and handwriting.
Yeah, it is. I'm giving a talk. I'm giving earlier in the year, or next year, I guess January, February, at some point. I'm doing a workshop for the Fractured Atlas folks, and the nature of the workshop is about communication and storytelling, and because I do feel like, listen, I mean, just on a human level, good communication is difficult at best, like even in a marriage, right? Like, and so when you ask, or when you tell maybe a legitimately introverted person that they've got to get in front of a crowd or communicate something, they may not like that very much, right? Because they're introverted or what have you. And I think, classically or stereotypically artists are, more, introverted, kind of quiet folks, maybe. But it is interesting how uncomfortable I've seen artists get when I talk about this. And I just like, look, it's okay to hate people. I hate people. But, when somebody asks you about your art, if there was ever a time to animate, that would be the time. And, I feel like if you're asked, you should be able to communicate. And, I sort of joke about, channel your inner Jeff Koons. I mean, Jeff was always such a great salesman, and some would argue his salesmanship might be better than his art. I don't know, not for me to say. But I feel like, that artists need to embrace the storytelling aspect and be able to tell their story.
For sure. Um, Scott, I want to ask a question that calling back to something that we were talking about earlier, and then I think we'll move into the more opinion segment. But you mentioned at least twice the rules, and I imagine they are unspoken. The unspoken rules of street art. Can you give me your top three unspoken rules of street art?
Well, let me sort of, I don't know, differentiate a little bit here. I don't know that street art has rules. Graffiti has rules.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
And historically, graffiti there was a culture, there were rules. You learn. There was almost an apprenticeship program. I mean, you learned from the OG guys. You were. Your reputation was built on your hard work and getting up. There were rules of engagement in terms of where you could tag, where you can't tag. You don't go over. If there's a piece done by a OG artist, you would never go over that because that would be the biggest insult. But yet, if I was a OG artist of 10 years and there was an OG artist of 20 years, he could go over my stuff, and so there was, and by the way, no private property, only public property. Like that was, because graffiti, to your point, yeah, pure graffiti is illegal, right? You don't have permission. You're getting up all over the city. And historically you didn't tag private property. That was taboo. It was only public property. And over the course of, 20, 30 years, that has really broken down. And it's interesting, young fans of hip hop and hip hop artists today, young artists today, just don't care about the history, don't care about the tradition from which they come. They're sort of just throwing out the rules, so to speak. And that's happening in graffiti too. I think there's a lot of, young graffiti artists that are just sort of, they don't care about the tradition. They don't care about the rules. And also, because of social media, they can do a few tags or throw ups or pieces and, take a photo, post it on social media and claim fame. When in fact, back in the day, you had to get out there and do the work. And it was word of mouth. There was barely any cameras around, let alone, a digital camera that you could post on social media and suddenly the world could see it and say, oh, that guy's a great artist. And within the culture, maybe that art, maybe they're fairly unknown or not even that respected. And there's also a thing, in graffiti artists or graffiti culture called biting, which is about basically plagiarism, stealing other people's work, biting. And so there was definitely a tradition of originality. If you weren't saying something new or doing something fresh and different, if you were just biting, you weren't getting the respect. And I think, and it's hard to, nothing new under the sun, right? There are traditions. People do get inspired by previous writers, what have you. And I think there's maybe more of an appreciation these days for kind of a mashup kind of an approach, where you're, quote unquote, borrowing or being inspired by, other people's aesthetics or traditions. And, I think, certainly if you're giving, attribution, maybe that's totally fine. But to claim it as your own would be controversial, I think.
Sure. All right. Well, then more opinions. Here we come. You may just, regurgitate the same info you already gave us a moment ago when you heard this first question, but that would be totally fine. So if somebody were to give you $10 million in funding for a new project or venture, what would you like to build with $10 million in the bank?
I would take that money and fund my art house project. Art house, by the way, I only need 3 million, so you can keep 7. So art house is a project that we've been developing now for a while. Actually, like all entrepreneurs, right? Just so excited about it. But art house is an unscripted reality show. And it's essentially about real people meeting real artists to buy real art for the first time without breaking the bank.
I
And
like it.
so, and yeah, thanks. And so essentially what it is, we find a couple, and I'm not talking about Miami, New York, LA, Chicago. I'm talking about Dayton, Ohio. I'm talking about Madison, Wisconsin. I'm talking about Wichita, Kansas, right? And there's a couple of family that has $2,000, and they want to do something they've never done before, which is to buy real art from a real artist. So, enter our expert, affable host, who meets the family, gets a sense of, who they are, how they live, what their taste might be, kind of what they're thinking in terms of art. And of course, the couples may be excited, intimidated, scared. They don't know. I've only got $1,000. I've only got 3,000. And then the guest will take them to meet 3 working artists in their studios, right? And we learn about these artists, and we learn about their art making. We learn about art. And essentially, of course, the audience is like, oh, I love that artist. I hate that artist. Hope they go with that artist. Hope they don't go with him. I hope they go with her. And then in the final act, there's the big reveal, which artist did they go with? And then there's we hang the art in the home, and there's, a big celebration. So we have our team, we have our showrunner, we have our production team. They're all former House Hunters people, so they know how to make the donuts. We've got our pitch reel ready to go. We need 3 million to make 8 episodes. And that's what I would use the money for.
Amazing. I hope this happens. I want to see that
Thank
show.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Me too.
really
And
entertaining.
I want it to happen for the artists, right? Because,
Absolutely.
in a world where a show like that is on Netflix, the exposure, whether you're the artist that the family went with or not, doesn't even matter, right? You're just getting this amazing exposure, and at scale, right? In a way that these artists wouldn't get otherwise. So yeah, hopefully we'll get there.
It's also
I
not
love
just impactful for the artists on the show, but it's impactful in the way that it shows people the art buying process, and that
Yes.
doesn't have to be this like intimidating thing. I mean, it would really open a lot of people's eyes to this idea, like, oh wow, I can go, like hit up this Instagram artist that I really like and go visit their studio. Like, that thought probably hasn't occurred to millions of people.
Yeah.
I love this idea. Of course, my cynical side, putting on my cynical, Hollywood executive hat would be like, I love this idea. It's very altruistic. It's all very feel good. We need some edge. So, what I want is not some couple with 2,000. What I want is like someone from the Real Housewives, right? Or like that kind of character to be the person out there going to these studios to like talk to these artists and is just awash in the most inane, self-regarding, narcissistic sensibility, and these artists are like suffering through this, and maybe every once in a while they like meet their match, and a sort of equally sort of narcissistic, dickish artist who's like totally challenging, and then you're still waiting to see what the outcomes are in terms of like what this person wants, and they're giving you this kind of lifestyles and the rich and famous. Or Selling Sunset, where they're like showing the work that they bought for their house and how much they love it, and they're talking to their friends about it, and they're totally getting the story wrong, right? They're like missing details about who the artist is and what the work was about and why they did it. And then of course then you cut away to the artist talking about how much they hated that client, but they needed the money because it allowed them to buy a CNC machine or something like that, right? Like that. Sorry, Scott. I would probably tune into that.
You're 100% right. No, this is exactly what we're up against, right? It's like, oh, no, not enough drama, not enough sex,
it's
not
like,
enough drugs, not enough whatever. It's like, yeah,
you can't there's parts of me that are idealistic about art. You and I have been in this neighborhood now for long enough to know that and what makes things entertainment is either you're either reaching for things high above you, which is tragedy, or you're making fun of the things that are low and beneath you, which is comedy. And art has tried to occupy so much of the territory, so much of the tragic territory on its own already, and it has taken itself so seriously already that there's a piece of me that's like, Listen, Velvet Buzzsaw this thing to death. You gotta bring in just like the worst behaving characters and see how they make do.
I can almost
It's
guarantee
funny
your
because
three,
it's true.
your
What's that?
3 million will probably come much faster with this.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
It's like, come on, Scott, great pitch, but who are we trying to offend here? I don't
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. This is Trump's America. It's Trump's
so
America.
true.
This is the type of
It's-
television show we need. We need
It's so
Don Jr.
true.
out there. What kind of art is Don Jr. out there?
Well,
Trying to, what studios is he getting into? He's going in, he's going to buy all of Hunter Biden's art now because, he's going to stay out of jail. And that's who you need.
The one good thing about your cynicism, Jonathan, is that actually it gives me a little hope, because in your model, we're actually, getting traction and having a conversation.
Totally.
The other day, we showed this project to a Hollywood agent, I should say, and they said, "Oh, yeah, no. I mean, we tried this with Gallery Girls, and it's been tried before, but it just doesn't work." Now, Gallery Girls was like a 2012 show. It was like a show from 2012, and by the way, very different than this show. But it's like, this is the as I was saying earlier, this conventional wisdom that somehow the arts and artists and the art world doesn't translate into a show that is entertaining or funny or dramatic is just, I think, shows more of a lack of imagination than anything. But it's rough out there.
I feel like it's actually the United States lags behind, at least like the UK in shows like this. I watched through like Sky Television, like Portrait Artist of the Year, Landscape Artist of the Year, these like reality competitions. I mean, I think they're pretty cool. I'm quite surprised why they haven't, there's no such thing in the United States. I have actually seen a show with a somewhat similar format to what you've described that was also, I think, that was coming out of the UK. I just remember because the host had an accent. But, I haven't seen anything like that in the States, but I have seen like more art-related shows coming out of Europe.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because, on Netflix, what is that that show, Blowing Glass, or Blowing, I think it's called.
Blown Away.
Blown Away, right. And they're blowing glass, and it's a kind of a competitive thing and whatever. Like, that show's doing really well. It's like in its
awesome.
fourth season, it's awesome. And then the shop that's based out of, their sales are booming, and their tourism is up in that community. So yeah, it can be done.
That show's amazing. There's also a really cool one called Drink Masters that's all about craft cocktail makers. And like, I remember, actually, this is great because your name is Scott Sourdough Power, but there was a guy on that show who they were tasked with making like a 3 cocktail flight or whatever. And he said he wanted it to be a 3-course meal. And he created a sourdough bread extract to put into this cocktail that was going to be the main course meal middle one. And I was like, what, sourdough extract for a cocktail just sounds like horrible. And the judges were like, this is phenomenal. Like, these people were like consummate pros. And I love these shows where you're just like pulling these artisans from like these just random industries. That Blown Away is amazing. And the first episode or season of Blown Away, the winner, I mean, if you watch it, I don't know if you've seen it, Jonathan, but the winner of that season is every bit a fine artist, who the thought that went into every piece was so deep. And then at the end, when they get to the end, there's 2 finalists. They have to put together a whole gallery room show, pretty small, but let's say a couple 100 square foot space, a cohesive exhibition of work. And these are not just like random people making, tourism blown glass. Like the stuff that they create is it's there's a whole story behind, what they're trying to, whatever it is. It's really quite nice.
Totally. I'm telling you, Real Housewives meets Selling Sunset meets work of art. It's a done deal. Here's 10 million. We'll take 2 seasons and
and who's sleeping with who?
Well, yeah, I mean, because you got to have the client has got to be like a Real Housewife. The broker agent dealer has got to be like Inigo Philbrick. And and then the artists, like there's so many artists that you could have, do these studio visits with that would, of any sort, because I mean, just like the amount of exposure and just getting their reactions to just the worst people in the world would also itself just be television gold.
Absolutely.
I could just see the cutaway from some inane comment and the artist just like, dying a little bit inside every time they have to hazard some sort of response to whatever it's going to be. And and it's going to be great. And eventually, people will come to identify with the folks who are doing the buying. It's like, regardless, it's like you've always got there's a sympathetic character there, a little bit of themselves. You're like, oh yeah, right. Like, I don't understand this either. Like, I get where they're coming from. And then, I would never have the bravery to say what that person just said in front of that, good for them. There's moments. I'm here for it.
I'm just picturing these artists turning into like Ralph Fiennes from The Menu and just
yeah. But then, but there you go. Then you get an Oscar nominee movie out of it.
So I want to amend my answer earlier because I said I would give you the 7 million back. I changed my mind. I'm going to keep that because I'm going to turn that into a development fund because there are so many cool ideas. Jonathan, and we're joking, we're having fun right now, but I mean, your bigger point is that there are so many interesting stories in our world that aren't being told. And there are, by the way, so many creative people out there with great ideas that that need to be developed and produced and seen and brought into the world. And we need money to do that. And by the way, the costs have gone down big time, right?
Right.
In terms of production and what have you. And if I had a $10 million development fund, we could throw some money around. We could hear pitches and we could underwrite and support some of these young voices that are coming up, and develop ideas. One of the other ideas I have, which is sort of half baked, is that because graffiti artists and graffiti art is such and street art to some extent is such a physical, almost athletic kind of endeavor. And also because art, is so subjective and the old idea of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I have a sort of a American Idol kind of idea. American Idol meets American Ninja Warrior for graffiti art, right? where there are these challenges and the artists have to scale the wall and get up there and make the piece and and then they've got to, there's certain challenges and constraints. And then of course the judges, have to vote and then, who got it done and who did it the best and did they meet the deadline and whatever. But then in the final episode, the two artists, so to speak, that get into the finale, get into the finals, they have to do their masterpieces, right? And they get a big wall on Hollywood Boulevard or the Sunset Strip or whatever, and they get however many days to do this big mural, this masterpiece work of art, and then the audience has to text in their favorite. And you've got 10 million people weighing in via text as to artist A or artist B winning. And I don't know. I think a show like that should exist, could exist, but I need that $10 million.
I like that. Yeah. Wall
Nobody
Wars.
wants to watch paint dry,
Wall
Scott.
Wars. Love that. Great name, Jonathan. Great name. What do I owe you? I want that. Okay, keep $1 million.
I just get an EP credit. That's fine. I just want an EP credit.
Okay.
All right, Scott. Question number 2 of the more opinion segment. Who is a person or what is a project happening in the art and cultural sector right now that you're not connected to, but who you really admire or think highly of and want to shout out to?
Yeah, the Meow Wolf guys. What they're doing is just and it was born out of desperation, right? If you know their story, their origin story in Santa Fe, It was classic. I mean, a bunch of young artists feeling not respected, not seen, not heard in the Santa Fe, art scene, and they took it upon themselves to make a name for themselves and started doing these parties and installations that eventually got noticed by a gallerist in Santa Fe that gave them a show. And they just knocked it out of the park with this sort of pirate ship, if you will, that they built inside this gallery that, was revolutionary at the time, and then eventually led to their first permanent installation, the first Meow Wolf installation there in Santa Fe. And now they're in, what, called Denver. They're in they're in Vegas. I think they're opening in LA soon. They've got multiple installations, and they're being, compared to the Disney Imagineers. Again, this is just what artists do. Artists innovate, artists create something out of nothing. Artists create worlds that we can't see or imagine. If we can empower them and facilitate those visions, they can inspire us to new heights. And so I'm not, you say I'm not connected. I actually, now that I think about it, I do know an artist over there, but hopefully my answer still stands. Meow Wolf is great. I love those guys.
Yeah, amazing. All right.
And by the way, let me just say this. I mean, one of the reasons why I love what they do is because they make art accessible. They're reinventing what art is and what art experiences could be. And that's why I like, a lot of art snobs, that we know and love. And sometimes I can be a snob too, but like we might scoff at the immersive Monet exhibit or the immersive balloon museum or whatever, it might be. But I think of these as gateway drugs. I think of these as doorways into the art world, and and that's great. It's great to put more rungs on the ladder so that people can climb up and they can go as high as they want or stay where they are. But as long as people are doing things that give artists economic opportunity, I'm all for. Anything that's putting more money in artists' pockets, I'm all for. That's my caveat.
Yeah, 100%. All right, Scott, last question of the More Opinions segment and this podcast. If you could steal any work of art or cultural artifact to have for yourself, you couldn't really tell anybody except maybe your immediate family, because it's been lifted. What piece of art or cultural artifact would you like to own for your own personal enjoyment?
Oh man, wow. That is a big question. That is a very big question. Oh my God, James Turrell.
Okay.
Yes. And he's doing an installation in Arizona, I believe. That is a completely like underground immersive, incredible installation, and I'd like to live in that.
Oh, interesting. So this is the new. So this is I think it's Rodent Crater, Terrell's Rodent Crater. Rather than stealing it, you could just occupy it and keep everybody else out.
That's right. Let me live in there. And by the way, my kids aren't invited. my son and daughter can visit, but they can't live with me.
That'd be amazing.
Well, this is, I was going to say this is the second guest who's picked an installation piece, I think. But actually, now that I think back to the other one, I think actually we had somebody who wanted to lift a performance piece, which is also hilarious.
Oh, that's cool.
They wanted to have this performance and be performed in their living space.
Yeah.
Well,
or you
Scott,
could, a real feat of geoengineering would be to make, disappear Rodent Crater and install it in the the desert outside of Los Angeles, and cloak it in some radar proof, Google satellite imagery proof scenario, such that it was just off the map and it was just yours.
Love that.
It's like a Despicable Me scenario for.
So good. So
All
good.
right, Scott. Well, for our listeners out there, please go check out Crewest Studio as well as Not Real Art. And for those of our listeners who have a few $1,000,000 lying around, let's get this show going. Reach out to Scott directly. He would gladly take your call, and we all want to see this show happen. So,
Well, I appreciate
Scott,
that. Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you
thank you
very
for coming
much.
on the pod and sharing with us your long storied past in the art world.
Storied indeed. And before we go, I do want to let people know that last year we stood up a nonprofit called Arterial, Arterial, arterial.org. We've been pretty much under the radar, kind of building it slowly, but we stood it up as a way of raising money to fund arts programming. For example, we'll raise money for Art House through the nonprofit. We've given grants we helped finish a art documentary called The Underbelly Project, which just debuted in Miami during Art Week, about an incredible street art project that happened underground in New York City in recent years. We've helped underwrite the Emmy Award-winning show Artbound, SoCal PBS Artbound. And so Arterial is really set up to help raise money to fund entertainment media for the arts. And so, by all means, folks, please please reach out and let us let us tell you our story. And we'd love to have your support.
Amazing. Well, we'll have to have you back on the pod and talk about some of those projects later.
I'd love it, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much for today. It's so fun being on this side of the mic. It's interesting though. It's very kind of off-putting too, because I know what questions I'm going to ask, but to not know what questions I'm going to be asked, it's sort of, I'm not used to that. So I apologize if I tripped over my tongue a little bit, but these were great questions and I had a great time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. We had a great time. It was a fun episode. We'll see you again soon.
Sounds good. Cheers.